Today I want to talk about macroeconomic equilibrium. It's just an introduction to equilibrium, and this is a topic that is going to get much more complex. So this is just your basics. I'm going to go about it a little bit differently. I'm going to show you the diagrams first, then I'm going to kind of go to some terms and theory, and then come back to some other diagrams just to show you a few of the differences that we're going to see. So first of all, let's just look at, we've taken aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply and put them on the same diagram. And this is really no different than what you did with demand and supply for microeconomics. Do keep in mind the difference between short-run and long-run in macroeconomics, which is that input prices are fixed, but output prices, the price you get to sell it at, remember input prices are your costs, output prices have gone up. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say short run. So in the first scenario, the average price level in the country is greater than what the equilibrium point should be. So just like in micro, what this means is that, producers are excited about this. They're like, great, our profit levels are up, so we're going to produce more. So they produce way over here at Y2, but demanders, of course, respond to the higher prices and go, well, we don't want to buy that much. So what you have is basically too much real GDP, or Y, too much real GDP produced compared to aggregate demand. So this is going to put downward pressure on prices. There's going to be excess short-run aggregate supplies, excess real GDP is created, and it's not all going to be bought up. So we're going to see price levels fall, and obviously they're going to fall towards equilibrium, which is the situation we see here. One side note, do note that I've used 3 different terms on the x-axis, just to keep it in your mind that all of them are acceptable. We're talking about national output, and we can use different names for that. Okay, so with a high price level, or if price level is higher than price level at equilibrium, aggregate demand is going to be less than short-run aggregate supply. There's going to be downward pressure on price, and we're going to move towards this point here. When price level is too low, again, we've done this 1,000 times, it's just the opposite. So when low price levels occur, aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. Therefore, there's going to be upward pressure on price, and we're going to work towards this scenario that we see here. This scenario that we see here, we're at PLE. Both aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are equal, so we have equilibrium shown for national output. It's referred to as short-run equilibrium. We'll talk more later about long-run equilibrium and how they're different, but for now, this is the term that you should be familiar with. Okay, like I said, this is macroeconomic equilibrium 101. It's an introduction to the concept, and it will get more complex. Some terms that we need to introduce at this point. First of all, we need to talk about the workforce. And this is only talking about labor, it's only talking about people. The need for that distinction will be obvious when we talk about what full employment means. But the workforce is saying all the people in a country who are willing and able to work. Okay? If I'm not able to work because of age or some disability, remember age on both ends. I'm too young to work or I'm too old to work. If I'm not able to work because of age or again some disability, well then I'm not really part of the workforce, and that's just not what this theory is talking about. The second part is willing to work. So I might be the right age to work, but I don't really want to work. I've got enough money, maybe. Maybe I want to focus on other things like oftentimes going to school, getting an education, or perhaps raising a family. Anyway, the point is, to be part of the workforce doesn't just mean that you have to be alive, it means that you have to be willing and able to work. Second term that we need to talk about is full employment. Now, one difference here is that here we mean full employment of factors of production. So yes, we mean full employment of labor, full employment of the workforce, but we also mean full employment of land and capital and entrepreneurship as well. In this case, entrepreneurship pretty much lumps itself into the workforce, though there's no real important distinction between entrepreneurs and laborers. This is somewhat similar to our concept of potential output that we've talked about before. It's not the exact same, and it's important that you understand how they are similar, but then how they're not similar as well. So two things we need to know. First of all, full employment doesn't really mean that we're being allocatively efficient. So, for example, at point A on the PPC, we're showing that we're reaching our potential, our 100% potential, but because we're only producing technology and not very much agriculture, it's not really what the macroeconomy most needs. Perhaps there's not enough food, maybe too many computers, whatever, okay? So we don't see allocated efficiency at A necessarily, nor do we see it at B. And even though C, we're not at our potential output, that is, we're not all the way on the PPC, it may actually be a more desirable situation because we have a more even split between these two possibilities, okay? So that's kind of one difference between the idea of full employment and potential output that we need to just kind of keep in mind. That is, that neither one of these are necessarily the most desirable. They can be, but they don't have to be. A more important distinction is this, and that's when we see our potential, the positive sloped line of best fit, and the actual output on the business cycle, that potential output can be exceeded by actual output, which is to say that you could be fully employed, right? Full employment can happen at a point that is beyond potential. It can also happen down here. There could be full employment of resources here at a point that is below potential output. So again, they're similar to each other in concept, but they're not the exact same thing. So full employment means that basically all of the factors of production that a country has available, and especially in the short run, we can see differences. All those factors of production that are available in the short run are 100% employed. So that's this idea here, which isn't necessarily the same as what we see over here. Again, it's not going to be a clean, perfect fit with all of our theories, okay? So full employment, so if I'm only working 20 hours a week, that's not full employment. I can work more than that. Full employment, if there's a factory that is half empty, it's not operating at full capacity, that's not full employment, okay? All right, then our third concept that we need to talk about, or term, is this idea of a natural rate of unemployment. And I have up here the term icky. It's kind of a concept that we need to be careful how we talk about. It's one of these that, to be honest, the economics profession gets a little bit of critique from other groups from, like, this is something that you say is okay, but it's not really okay. We'll spend more time talking about what that means in the future, but let me give you a brief overview right now. The idea of the natural rate of unemployment says that the workforce doesn't have to be 100% employed. Now again, keep in mind, we're not talking about people who aren't old enough or are too old, and we're not talking about people who don't want work. This idea says that of the people who want work, it's never going to be possible to fully employ all of them. And that doesn't mean just because 1 or 2 or 3% of the people in your workforce are out of work, it doesn't mean that your economy is doing poorly. Again, to make a bad sports analogy, choose your sport, nobody's ever going to make 100% of their shots. That doesn't mean that you're a bad player, it doesn't mean that you're playing poorly, it just means that's kind of how it goes. So in economics, what we're going to say here is that there is a certain amount of employment, or unemployment I should say, that is acceptable. We have names for this and we'll talk about them later, but for now all you need to know that the natural rate of unemployment, depending on the country that you're talking about, it can be maybe as high as 9% and probably no lower than about 3%. And a simple example of this is, say I'm an engineer and I'm looking for an engineering job in Johannesburg and I can't find one, so I'm unemployed. It just so happens that there's an engineering job that's perfect for me that's available in Cape Town. And they've been advertising and they can't find a suitable candidate. So it's just kind of a case of I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time. It doesn't mean the economy is not healthy. There's a job for me. I just don't know about it yet. Bringing those two ideas together, the idea of macroeconomic equilibrium in the short run and the idea of full employment and potential, you have 3 different situations that can occur. Okay, let's start here, and this is probably what we would most want to see. These other 2 scenarios are less desirable. So here, what we're saying is I've put in this green dashed line, and I'm calling it income or national income potential. That's what the P means. So what we're saying in this case is basically the short-run equilibrium that we find ourselves in is equal to our potential output. That is, we've reached macroeconomic equilibrium in the short run, and it also is at a place where we're producing exactly what we would want to. If we go back to my running a marathon metaphor, this is where you're running along at a solid pace and you feel good, and it's a pace that's going to get you to the finish line, at your best time, at your best possible time. So this is, you're running a good race, and you're gonna, you're gonna finish in a time that you really like. Okay. Here, this is where basically the short-run equilibrium you find yourself at is somewhere below what your potential is. Okay, so what this terms we use to refer to this is we call this a deflationary or recessionary gap. And by gap, we actually mean a physical gap. It's the distance or difference beneath or less than potential national output. So it's this little gap right here. So the distance between Y1 and potential, that's going to be a deflationary or recessionary gap. What's going to happen in this is that basically your unemployment rate is going to be greater than what NRU should be. So if your NRU is say 4 or 5% on the 4%, this would mean that your unemployment rate is something greater than that. That could be because you're not at macroeconomic equilibrium. On the other hand, it could be that you are at short-run equilibrium, but that short-run equilibrium is a point below what it should be. So again, to go back to our marathon example, this is you're running along and you feel like you're pushing yourself hard enough, but you just aren't. Okay, so you're going to end up being slower than what you hope to be, even though you felt like you were in a good spot. Okay, we'll talk more about that later on. The opposite of that is what we call an inflationary gap. So now our point of short-run equilibrium, and again, it's really important we keep in mind this is short-run. It's very temporary. So our point of short-run equilibrium is beyond what we can potentially do. Okay, so again, the inflationary gap is the distance between those 2 points. Okay, you're never asked to measure what the inflationary gap is. The point is that it exists. Okay, so again, this is I'm running too fast. I feel like I'm on a good pace. I feel like I'm doing well, but I'm actually running faster than I should be, and I'm going to get tired later on and fall back to a slower pace. And anyway, okay, end of the bad metaphor. Sometimes people are unclear of how these two situations can exist. Well, this could be, again, where you're hiring people up at a rate more than what you should be. Say most people are used to working 40 hours a week, and you're hiring them up and working 50 hours a week. You can produce more than your potential for a short time, but it's not sustainable. Okay? Here, again, in this situation, what can occur is that maybe people are being hired up, but they're just working less than their capacity. They're working maybe 30 hours a week instead of 40. There's a little bit of an argument for that. The point is that basically there's a good amount of people who are out of work and who would like to work, but the amount of real GDP, the amount of real GDP that is being bought up at this price level is stable in the short run, even though there's too many people who are out of work.